So what we'd like to do is watch this video, just to give you a break. So this is John Marion talking himself about what he's doing. It's only 4 minutes, so let's just watch him explain himself and see what you think of what he says.
So to speak, the history.
Let's try and turn up, shall we? Okay. Oops.
My first expertise is the history of modern philosophy. And I came to phenomenology because of that. Because if you study early modern philosophy up to Hegel, you discover that philosophy became at that moment something special, which can be named metaphysics. That is a systematic view of philosophy, where everything is known, I would say, to oversimplify, top down. That is, you have principles. From those principles, you can deduce some derivative truths and try to apply them on different fields. So mostly you deduce and you classify, starting with the same set of concepts and using those concepts by combinations, adaptations, complications to be close as possible to the concrete things. So it is an a priori philosophy. That's why it ends up, with Hegel and others, into building systems. This great endeavor did not fail. It partly won. And a part of the experience can be explained that way. That is everything which can become an object. It's why sciences come from metaphysics. Metaphysics was a theory of how to build up objects, and sciences have used this set of concepts to rule their own, each of them, their own field. So we can know, constitute, produce, reproduce objects that way. But the fact was that, and this is the crisis of the 19th century I refer to, that there are fields which cannot be understood by a deductive system. And very soon the question was, should we not start from down up? It is not a question of empiricism. Empiricism can be metaphysical and systematic as well, because empiricism is not that empiricist. Because in empiricism, you always presuppose that your own mind will stay before, and to some extent outside of the experience. We get everything through experience, through senses, etc. But the mind of the scientist, which is supposed to stay in a position of organizing, ruling, judging, the scientist. So empirical sciences are only half empirical. The real question is whether even the self, the knowing self, can be experienced a posteriori. That is, in fact, we experience that I myself, the real self, not the transcendental I, is a product of my own experience. So this idea to start from the things themselves and to try to, coming from that, to reach their rational reality, that was the project of phenomenology. And to sum it up, metaphysics is based on the distinction made by Kant between what we know, that is a phenomenon, and what we don't know, which is the Ding and Sich, the thing in itself. And the goal of phenomenology is to identify what appears, the phenomenon, with the thing in itself.
There you are. So he summarised what I've just said, which was, so he makes this distinction, and we'll see this in the text itself, between a priori, and a posteriori. A priori is where you see the thing, you have a preconceived theory. A priori. A posteriori means you know it after the experience. Now, what Marianne was just saying was that how do you know that your mind is separate from experience, as if you can view it from outside? He says you're always in the experience anyway. You're never outside. So objectivity is impossible. He thinks that a priori doesn't help because there's no such place. He says there's only experience a posteriori. That's what he was saying there. And so you can see he is skeptical then of the sciences. He says they can only tell us so much, but they can't tell us everything because they presuppose that you can separate the mind from reality as if it's a separate objective tool or machine. I don't know if you've picked it up, probably you didn't, but he's very, very French English. So his accent is very French. Yes. Exactly. So if you didn't understand it, well, neither did I. But it's kind of very thick French accent. Now he gives an example. So moving on, now we're going to get to the text in a minute, but let's look at the example of excess on your handout. So he talks about, remember I talked about at the beginning, before the break, about the idea that things might overflow or be a saturated phenomenon. Well, you might say, well, what's an example of that? Well, he says, take an event. So listen to what he says. He says, the event does not result from a production which would deliver it as a product, decided and foreseeable according to its causes and as a consequence reproducible following the repetition of such causes. To the contrary, in happening, it attests to an unforeseeable origin, rising up from causes unknown, even absent, at least not assignable, that one would not therefore any longer reproduce. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, an event you can't plan or reproduce. So imagine that you had a fantastic party, say when you were young, or whenever, maybe when you celebrated your 18th birthday, or whenever that was. Now, if you said, I want to have that 18th birthday party again. Now, Marianne says, how could you? Because that was a once-in-a-lifetime experience with particular people, friends, moments, experiences. It's not reproducible. It's not a production. You can't say, I want the birthday party that I had 5 years ago. I want that party. It was fantastic. I felt great. All my friends were there. This music was playing. This celebration happened. This speech happened. And he said, well, if you take the event, could you contain the event? So I could say, don't worry, I will give you, here it is, the event you experienced 5 years ago. There it is. Well, I can't do that because it's not reproducible. I can't even describe what made it such a good event. What was it that produced it? Could I really do the same again? Could I produce the same effect? Will I have to invite the same people? Maybe, but maybe they won't say the same things. Maybe there was a particular ingredient that made the party just the kind of party that I loved. And so what he's saying is that an event does not result from a production. You can't say, I want that birthday party I had 5 years ago. You can't produce it, which would deliver it as a product, decided and foreseen, foreseeable according to its causes, and as a consequence reproducible according to the repetition of such causes. So I can't repeat the event. You see the point? But the event was real. To the contrary, in happening, i.e. an event is something that happens. It attests to an unforeseeable origin rising up from causes unknown, even absent, at least not assignable, that one would not therefore any longer reproduce. So basically he's saying that the sheer amount of things that you would have to reproduce perfectly to get that event back is impossible. The event is now, he says this, you nonetheless experience that event, and you think about that event as if you want it. So you know the event. You know what the event felt like. You know it was real. But if you were to say, I want it again, it's unrepeatable. So you see what he's trying to do? He's trying to identify an excess experience that's real, but nonetheless can't be captured or produced or done again. And he calls that, this is what he calls the saturated phenomenon. So an event, like your birthday party, is a saturated phenomenon, which can't be reproduced again. So I can't say, go to Amazon and say, I want to order my birthday party for £100. Can't do it because it's not purchasable. So in his treatment, look at what I've written down here, in his treatment of saturated phenomena, in Being Given, which is the big book, Marion analyzes aspects of saturation based on Kantian categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. For Marion, the event I'm describing, your birthday party, saturates the category of quantity, or rather events are impossible to contain or describe in terms that privilege one narrative. Now, you can read this in your own time, but he gives this example. I'll just talk to you about it. Take the famous Battle of Waterloo. This was a famous battle in Europe between the British and the French and the Russians. It took place in 1815, I think. Now, if you say, I was at the Battle of Waterloo, I was there. Well, what is the Battle of Waterloo? Can you say, here it is, there's the Battle of Waterloo, this is it? Of course you can't. Because the Battle of Waterloo was huge. And there was multiple accounts of what caused it, what happened at it. Basically, there's too much to tell the story. And yet we say, the Battle of Waterloo happened. Now, isn't it interesting? We're treating the Battle of Waterloo as if it's an object. As if I could say, look, the Battle of Waterloo. But it's not like that, says Marion. It's a saturated phenomenon. And yet we describe it as if it was a definite object, as if we could have it. You know, Sully, were you at the Battle of Waterloo? Yes, I was. Or no, I wasn't. And were you, Effie? You could say, yes, I was at it. But that's two different viewpoints, but you were both there. But the viewpoint was so excessive, you could never put it in a bottle. Say, there it is, the Battle of Waterloo. That's basically his point. Okay? That you can experience events and you know what saturation is because you know that there are things that you experience in the world that you couldn't possibly reproduce, like the event. Okay. Any questions on that? Or any observations? Are you all persuaded by Jean-Luc Marion? Maybe you're all converted to being followers of Jean-Luc Marion. I don't know. But you could see now. This is what he does. He says metaphysics is at an end. He says up there, because science can only capture this one part of reality. But he wants to get back to the things themselves. And when he does, that can be an excess because it breaks over the boundaries of Kantian limits of seeing the thing as it is, as you perceive it. And he says you can't go into an understanding a priori. You can only apprehend it at the same time. It's part of your experience. You can never separate the mind from experience. They're two things that go together. And so that's a valid form of interpretation, interpreting the world. And in fact, the a priori, going in there with a theory, is not going to capture that much reality. Now, did you notice what he said? He said that, well, metaphysics has been successful. It's produced the mobile phone, the lights, and so on. However, that's not the whole story of reality. And so if we talk this way about God or about soul or about those things, it's not like that. He says it's more like an event that's a saturated overflow. Okay. Right. Let me hand out to you something which I want you to, we're going to try and go through a bit of this today. Any questions or any comments you've got so far? Any observations? So we just pause there for a minute. Any sort of things you would like to observe or notice?
Based on the example that Marianne gave, does it mean that we cannot repeat something same 2 times or 3 times again and again?
Well, he says you could experience something. Well, imagine, take my example of the birthday party, or his example is the Battle of Waterloo. My example is your birthday party. Now, he says that if you were to describe Ephraim's birthday party, and you were to describe it as if it was some kind of object or thing, my birthday party, you might say. Now, he says you're right to use that language and to use the language of there was something called Ephraim's birthday party. But you could never, if you were to say, how do we then describe your party? He says you wouldn't use analytic tools. You wouldn't say, let's analyze this scientifically and summarize what we mean by the meaning of the word birthday party. I use your mind. Instead, it would only be that kind of category. It would be an experience that you had that was real. And so he wants to say that it makes sense for you to say, my birthday party, but you can't use the language of analysis. That's inappropriate. Instead, because you could never, if you said, I want my birthday party again, he would say, you can't do it. Because your birthday party is something that happened, but it would never do to try and describe it or analyze it or write about it or subject it to logic or science. It doesn't work. Do you see your point? Roughly. Okay. Any other questions or observations you might have? Yeah?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's just it makes me feel like he makes Kant unnecessary in a sense. Like he can actually develop it directly from empiricism instead of like Kant is trying to synthesize a priori and it's like.
Yeah, exactly. Now, is he just asserting? You know, you're right. I mean, Kant came on and tried to do precisely this. He tried to rationalize the a priori and the a posteriori and explain empiricism and rationalism, bring it together. So, hasn't Kant done the job, you might say? Well, people like Husserl comes on and says, break out of Kant, go back to the thing themselves. Marianne wants to go even further and say, can we talk about saturation? I mean, you could say, it's rubbish. It's impossible. But can you see what Marianne's trying to say? There's more experience.
Yeah.
You saw that quote.
Yeah.
Now, this is my big puzzle that I asked before the break. What can you do with Marianne? Is it just a protest? Protesting against Kant? Maybe some of you will feel like protesting against Kant after your experiences. But in the end, do we end up returning to Kant? Become and asking, what do we know? So, if maybe the full circle is that we all come back again to Kant after being with Marianne and Heidegger. You say, oh, forget that. Let's go back to Kant and people like that. Let's read what he has to say and see what you think. I mean, let's hear the man himself speak, and then Again, this is good. It's good that you feel you're doing. That's good, because that's the point. And it's all right to say, because lots of philosophers say the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, people like me and others who have been studying this for years are still wondering what to do. Anyway.
Thank you.
So this is the first reading I gave you, and we're not going to get a chance. We're not going to try to read the whole thing today. As you can see, it's far too long. But you know, what we're doing here, in looking at this text, is we're looking at Marianne's own discussion about what we've just talked about. Now, I would think this is, in terms of the readings I've given you, this is, it's not bad, it's quite clear in places. What you find is that when you read Jean-Luc Marian, just to give you an example, give you some help here, is that Marian, if you don't understand what he's saying, he often repeats himself. So Marianne's style of language is he's very repetitious. So he says things again and again. And normally, by the time you get to the very end, if you don't understand what on earth he's talking about, go to the last few pages. Often he gives a really good summary. So don't be disheartened when you read it. You'll find that he clears it up. So he's actually a good writer in one sense, but he's also he tries to show off a bit in terms of his writing. Most philosophers, if you notice, some like to be very clear and some like to be very clever. Marianne is very clever, but is he very clear? So let's read what he says. We're going to read portion A and try to do that, and then we're going to try and jump into portion D, and then we'll have a look at portion F, and then finally look at portion H. So we might not even get through all that, but let's do this. We're going to take it as slow as we can and see what you think and see if you get what he's saying. So let's read portion A. I'm going to read this to you and then see what you think. The question of God certainly does not begin with metaphysics. Right, I've got that already. But it seems, or at least it managed to appear, that since metaphysics was coming to an end, being completed and disappearing, the question of God was also coming to a close. Throughout the past century, everything happened as if the question of God would have to make common cause, whether positively or negatively, with the destiny of metaphysics. Everything also happened as if, in order to keep the question of God open so as to permit a rational worship of him, it was absolutely necessary to stick to the strictly metaphysical meaning of all philosophy. So you might know, it doesn't mean to stop there at that point, a famous philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche said God is dead. And the reason why Nietzsche said that is he thought that philosophy was kind of running out of explanations. So that's what he meant. He meant that metaphysics is coming to a close. And it seems that because God seemed to be part of philosophy, and because philosophy was explaining away God, that God would cease to exist, because philosophy had proved that God didn't exist. So he says this is only true if it's absolutely necessary to stick to the rational worship of him. You see the point? So he's trying to get over the fact that Nietzsche has said God is dead by taking God away from metaphysics. Let's go on. But could one not, and thus should not one, also pose an entirely different and opposing preliminary question? Is all philosophy really equivalent to metaphysics? In order to remain rational, must the question concerning God necessarily and exclusively take the paths that lead to the God of the philosophers and the scholars, just because those paths issue necessarily from the decision of metaphysics? On the one hand, this reversal of the question might surprise or even disturb, or on the other hand, it might appear to dodge the radicality of the past century's philosophical situation. Nevertheless, it seems to be inevitable, since only such a reversal still truly leaves open the possibility of taking the proper account of at least 3 questions. I will evoke them here without claiming to answer them explicitly. At least as regards its historical destiny, did metaphysics not reach its end positively with Hegel and negatively with Nietzsche? So you might have seen that Hegel, with Nick Adams, Hegel really is the triumph of philosophy. Hegel thinks, basically, that if philosophy will reach the final end, that through a spirit of history will take it to the final grand conclusion of understanding. That's Hegel, effectively. Very elitist in some ways, don't know what you think about Hegel. Hegel's a very elitist idea. He seems to think that philosophy is the real answer. But of course, Nietzsche thought that as I just said, if you follow philosophy, God is dead. Because we can prove God doesn't exist, allegedly, says Nietzsche. So you can see that didn't metaphysics reach its end positively with Hegel, says Marianne, and negatively with Nietzsche? Secondly, was philosophy not devoted throughout an entire century to overcoming that end by assuming non-metaphysical forms, of which the most powerful, I'm not saying the only, remains phenomenology? So Husserl, Heidegger, comes along and says, get back to the things themselves. That's the end of so one wants to try and be non-metaphysical and talk about the things themselves. 3, does Christian speculative theology, understood in its exemplary figures, you see here Aquinas, belongs to metaphysics in the strict sense, or has it responded to the peculiar conceptual demands of the revelation that prompted it? So, does Christian theology or speculation, does it start with revelation, he's saying, or does it start with philosophy? And so, has philosophy or metaphysics responded to the peculiar, and when you say peculiar, you mean special demands of the revelation that prompted it? So if you read a book, the Bible or the Quran, and you say, on the basis of reading that book, I now believe, that might have started you to think about philosophy. You might start thinking about the existence of God. But, what Marianne is saying there is that the right response? Is philosophy the obvious vehicle to use in response to revelation? So those are his questions. And so if you read this chapter, effectively he's examining those 3 questions. Now we've covered some of that already by looking at some of the quotes here and listening to what he says. So if you want to just, any questions about that? Anything you observe? Anything you are interested to ask about, or things you don't understand, or anything? Any observations? And this is the first time we're looking at this, so it's unfair to ask you to say anything. But if you don't be afraid to ask anything you want. Okay, do you want to move on a bit to portion D on page 54. Now, let's see what he says about this is again an elaboration of what we've already seen. So he says this: at present, the end of metaphysics affects most visibly at one privileged point the being par excellence. That's Heidegger speaking. Indeed, if the figure of the ground no longer allows us to legitimate the concept of metaphysics in general, it follows that the assimilation of God to the function of ultimate ground in particular becomes illegitimate. Now that's Heidegger speaking, the idea that, being is infected with God and all that sort of stuff. If that becomes illegitimate, then talking about God and being at the same time is also illegitimate. Then he goes on, this identification runs through the entire course of philosophy and its metaphysical figure. It always interprets this ground on the basis of effectivity or actuality. This is his quote: active being by essence, according to Aristotle, no pure act without any potentiality for Aquinas, self-caused cause, causa sui, following Descartes, sufficient reason for the universe with Leibniz. Now, he's quoting those philosophers to say, look at those philosophers, they're all thinking in terms of the ultimate. And so he's saying, well, there you go. That's really theology working behind the scenes in metaphysics. Now, if you could, up to this point, Marian is effectively copying Heidegger. You could say he's plagiarizing Heidegger. He goes on, by God, metaphysics therefore means the being par excellence that operates as and through efficiency, such that it can ensure a ground for every common being through the metaphysica specialis. Specialis means God, or means the special metaphysics of revelation. Now, up till now, this is just Heidegger. The end of metaphysics, he goes on, provokes this death of this God. This is Nietzsche speaking. Yet one must measure its true scope against the aggressive or resigned platitudes that seize upon this theoretical event. At issue is not denying any greatness to this determination of the divine by the efficiency of the ground, nor is it a matter of underestimating its theoretical fecundity. So he's saying, philosophy of religion is okay, it's good so far as it goes. It is simply a matter of honesty, posing this question: does the effectivity of the ground, really allow us to think the way in which God is God, even in philosophy? So even if philosophy of religion works, is it really honest? Even for the God of the philosophers and the scholars, do causa sui, sufficient reason, purus actus, or energy, offer a sufficiently divine name to make God appear? At the very least, it is impossible today not to admit at least the possibility of such a suspicion. Now, this simple possibility suffices for recognizing the death of God in the end of metaphysics. For it should not be possible for the divinity of God to be lacking, as if it is lacking, if only imperceptibly, then God is already no longer at issue, but rather God, who is the stigmatized as an idol by these quotation marks. And then finally, if the death of God in philosophy belongs essentially to the end of metaphysics, and if the latter essentially from the concept of metaphysics, then overcoming the ontotheology becomes the condition for surpassing the name-giving God in philosophy as efficient ground. Now, that portion D is Heidegger, isn't it? Because you remember that gobbet I gave you about Heidegger saying the real God is the non-thinking God. It's the God of not of the philosophers, but the God of faith or belief. Effectively, Marian is building upon Heidegger. So that's an evidence there that Marian is very dependent on Heidegger. And in fact, the more you read Heidegger, this is my suspicion, the more you suspect that Marian and Paul Ricoeur have nothing new to say, because they repeat Heidegger and just elaborate or orchestrate Heidegger's themes. And there's a good example, effectively saying what you've heard Heidegger already say, that God is beyond philosophy. Any observations you've got? Anything that strikes you at all?
Just wondering why some philosophers just like Nietzsche more than Heidegger, but there's some very consensus between them.
Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche is one of the most powerful, well-represented heroes of philosophy, more than Heidegger. Heidegger is not understood enough. Nietzsche makes straightforward statements like God is dead, and everyone says, but Heidegger doesn't say anything that's, he says godless thinking and God without being God. But you can see his basic argument is that why throw God in with metaphysics? Because then you could say God is dead like Nietzsche and God is dead. But why not take God out of that situation? and speak of the different God. Now that's Heidegger effectively being repeated by Marian. Good. Any other observations? Everybody studying? You still convinced? Marianne's the man? Good. Well, let's press on then. Now this is the most difficult passage, okay? Portion F. But it's actually quite not the most difficult, but it's quite important that you get it. Now, do you remember, just when you introduce this passage here, do you remember this distinction here between the a priori and the a posteriori? And he wants to say, start with experience, not theory. That's it. And now, here we go. The principle of principles, here we go, that's Husserl. Remember that? Get back to the things themselves. The principle of principles posits that in the beginning of philosophy and first experience, there is only intuition. Yet insofar as it gives every phenomenon and it initiates phenomenality in general, intuition is at work prior to any a priori as the originary a posteriori. What's he saying there? An essential paradox emerges, here we go, explains it. The sole legitimate a priori in phenomenology becomes the a posteriori itself. The formula of principle of openness must not lead us astray. So what's he saying? He says, in the end, you can't actually approach something a priori. You might think, well, that's the first thing, isn't it? A priori is the first thing you say about anything else. A posteriori comes afterwards, after your experience. And yet he thinks, well, his argument is that phenomenology reverses that the experience becomes the priority and it's better than the a priori. So again, he's being totally consistent with metaphysics. He's trying to get rid of all theory and says experience comes first, effectively. Now he says, now there's a danger in Husserl, because Husserl calls this idea the principle of all the principles. And yet Marian is saying, well, that's a theory, isn't it? So Husserl has made a mistake. He's trying to apply a principle. And in the end, he's got to rely on experience. So the principle here, if you just go down, so it must not lead us astray. The principle here is that there is no principle at all. At least if by principle we mean what precedes, that starting from which. Or, in other words, what takes the place of a principle, namely intuition as givenness, always precedes the consciousness of it, which we receive as if after the fact. The reduplication of principle in the principle of principles, therefore, must not be understood as the statement of another principle, after those of identity or sufficient reason. That would be more essentially a priori than the preceding ones. So what's he saying? Don't be beguiled into doing theory. Don't start to say phenomenology is my system. It's not a system. Just allow the thing to give itself to you without system or a priori reasoning. Instead, this is just on that line, instead one must think of it as in a matter of the superlative, here we go, as a non-principle that surpasses all the previous principles insofar as it states that there is the beginning, there is no transcendental a priori principle, but indeed an intuitive a posteriori. Givenness precedes everything and always. So there you go, what I've just said. No theory, the superlative is the saturated idea of overflow. Hence, phenomenology goes unambiguously beyond metaphysics in the strict sense that it gets rid of any a priori principle in order to admit givenness, which is the originary precisely insofar as it is an a posteriori for the one who receives it. Phenomenology goes beyond metaphysics insofar as it gives up the transcendental project in order to allow the development of the finely radical empiricism. Finely radical because it is no longer limited to the sensible intuitions, but admits all originary giving intuition. Now, I know he uses lots of funny language, but his basic point is the same, is that Allow the thing that gives itself to give itself without restriction. And that's what he's really saying there. And don't apply anything that goes instead of experience. And finally, he says in the final paragraph, this reversal of the a priori principle in favour of the a posteriori immediately entails two determinate theses containing ontologia and ground, respectively. The first follows directly from givenness. The appearance of phenomena is operative without having recourse to being, at least necessarily or in the first instance. Indeed, here it is a matter of intuition whatsoever of the fact of its giving itself or of fleshly presence. These three terms suffice to define the perfect phenomenality of the phenomena without having recourse to any way to being, or even less to the objective concept of being. Right, okay. So hopefully you've got it. Is that experience comes before theory. A posteriori precedes a priori. It turns out, in the reversal of those two things, your experience and your immediate experiences of what it is that gives itself takes priority over everything else. And you're not trying to compare it with the ground. You're not describing it as the ground of being or the ultimate. Don't use those terms, says Marianne. Just be a pure phenomenologist and allow the thing to give itself, and don't try to apply a principle. Any questions about that, or comments on it, or what do you think? Is this stirring you up? Are you illuminated, or still the same puzzle?
I'm just thinking that at first you mentioned that Marian wants to put together between analytical and continental, but at the end, at least until now, I'm still confused.
Well, exactly. Well, no, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
He's saying he's not really explaining. He's saying that if you start with experience and no theory, and you get rid of the scientific attitude, all that, then he's not joining analytic and continental.
Yeah.
He's just abolishing analysis.
Yeah.
So when he says in his quote that science is useful, does he really mean it? And you could criticise him for being contradictory or effectively trying to do two things at once. But really, in the end, this particular piece is all about the demolition of metaphysics and anti-analysis, basically. That's what it is. So don't try to... I was saying, is it possible to draw the two together? He seems to be quite sympathetic to that in what he said on the quote, but ultimately, I think you're correct, that he's not really, he's just being very... It sounds great. Wow, getting back to the original object and it's speaking for itself. But when you try to stand back, do you do what Yang said, go back to Kant and say, let's forget Marianne and Heidegger, try to understand things as they are understood in our minds.
Yeah.
But he says he's talking the language of religion. He says this is how religious people talk.
Yeah.
They say I can't explain it. It came, it was amazing, it was bigger than I could possibly think, it was real. And he says, well, how do you talk about that language? And the philosophers are trying to explain it, but surely he says, I'm trying to describe it. So maybe what he's doing is description, not analysis. And that's really the role of it. So further to my question, what is the use of Marian? Maybe what he does is he describes experience very well, that he gives a kind of a language of talking about religion, but not as a philosopher would. Incidentally, you're right. Don't worry, Effie, you're right. It's a puzzle. Okay, what have we got time? Okay. Another time. Okay, can I just ask the question practically? Thank you very much, by the way, all for bearing with Marian. I said I missed the session last week, and I apologise for that because I had an appointment that overran, and I couldn't get out of it. I had to stay in the room, so I had to send you that message. Now, I believe that next week, normally, you're expecting to have a lecture on Wednesday. Is that correct? Was that on the timetable?
Yeah.
Is that on the timetable? So can I put an extra session in next week? Monday and Wednesday?
Yes.
Yeah.
Would that work for you?
Yeah.
Does it work for you? Ian?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll get rid of, talk to Ali as well. So
Ali already
He replied.
replied.
he's okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. I wondered if he thought that I was cancelling this week and for next week, because he's not here today. I know that he's recently, his wife has just recently given birth to a child.
Yeah.
So he's got other things to do. He's saturated with the presence of his new daughter,
Yeah.
which you can't talk about philosophically. It is an overwhelming experience, and so he can't be here. I think we all understand, even though we don't understand it. So yeah, he can't be here. So 2 extra sessions then. No, just 1 extra session. We will meet Monday next week and Wednesday. And you need the time, believe me, to consider this wonderful man, Jean-Luc Mann. Okay, good. Thanks for coming. And we ran out of time, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you.
We have 2 sessions.